Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Kramer, and I'm Donor Relations Manager at Ragdale. And while I'm a little sad that we're not able to gather today in the cozy living room of the Ragdale house, I'm super happy about how many people are able to join us because we're online. We have participants from coast to coast, and I'm so happy to see all your wonderful faces. I'm also very excited about our guest, Joanna Rakoff. And after having just finished the book, I feel like I got to know her just as she was getting to know herself and finding her voice. So, Joanna Rakoff is the author of the international best-seller My Salinger Year, which was a finalist for the Elle Prix and the WIZO Prize, and named a best book of 2014 by The Guardian and many other publications. The feature film, starring Sigourney Weaver and Margaret Qualley, premiered at the Berlin Film Festival earlier this year and will be released worldwide in October. Rakoff also wrote the screenplay. Joanna is also the author of the best-selling novel A Fortunate Age, winner of the Goldberg Prize for Fiction and the Elle Readers Prize, among others. As a journalist, she's written for Vogue, Elle, Marie Claire, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Her new memoir, The Fifth Passenger, will be in bookstores, presuming bookstores ever reopen, in fall of 2021. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you guys for having me. And I, like you, am sad that this isn't happening at Ragdale, and sad that I'm supposed to be at Ragdale right now. I'm really sad that I'm not there. And finishing my new book, which is what's supposed to be happening right now. But this is pretty exciting because so many friends of mine are here, friends from all over the country. So that is pretty exciting.
So you were supposed to be at Ragdale now, and your last residency at Ragdale was 20 years ago in 2000. What were you working on back then, and what was it like to be at Ragdale?
That's right. So I came to Ragdale. This is me 20 years ago. And this is a photo of me in my studio at Ragdale in September 2000. September, October 2000. It's somewhere in there. I came to Ragdale ostensibly. My application was for a project that was basically my thesis, my grad school thesis. I did my MFA in poetry, and I thought that I was going to be a poet and that I was going to potentially take an academic job teaching poetry and literature at some point in the nebulous future, after I published this collection that you see spread out on the floor there. And I got to Ragdale. I was about a year out of grad school. I did my MFA at Columbia. I was about a year out of grad school, and I had started to write for magazines at that point. My first piece was actually for The Atlantic, and I was writing book reviews for newspapers all over the country. I had some professors at Columbia who really encouraged me to write nonfiction. And maybe because I was a terrible poet, I don't know. Anyway, and so I got to Ragdale, and the point of the residency was really for me to just work on this collection. My plan was to kind of get it in shape. I had submitted it to some small presses and also some first book contests, and I had been a finalist in them. And I thought, I'm going to take the feedback from these editors and turn this book around. Maybe I'm going to write some new poems. I'm going to leave here with a new in-shape poetry manuscript that I'm going to send off to contests again, and I'm going to generate as much poetry as possible. And then what actually happened was I got a bunch of magazine assignments before I left. So I spent a lot of time, I swear, in a phone booth. Was there a phone booth there? There was some sort of phone booth that I used to interview people, and I was frantically writing articles. And also I had just started work on a long short story that I didn't know what I was doing, but I was very excited about, but I didn't want to tell anyone about it. And so I spent more time, honestly, writing those articles and working on this story, and also taking long walks around the grounds and also around Lake Forest. I, like everyone in the world, had loved John Hughes movies in my youth, so I was trying to picture, John Hughes growing up there, and trying to deepen my understanding of John Hughes movies. But I'm really thinking about my life. And so my time at Ragdale was really pivotal for me, because I did really figure out during that time that despite having just done a degree in poetry, and despite the fact that I had actually had like some success as a poet, I had published in the Paris Review and all these good places, I had won awards, I really had thought for my whole life kind of that was my path, but I realized that I was kind of just done, that I didn't want to write poetry anymore. The manuscript, I felt like it was okay, but it felt kind of dead to me. And I was much more excited about the prose that I was writing. So I went home, and that was really, I didn't tell anyone, I didn't say to the world, like, I'm done with poetry. But I did focus much more on my articles and this novel that eventually became my first novel.
So there might be some people here that haven't read your books. Would you please give us a thumbnail sketch of your two novels, A Fortunate Age and My Salinger Year?
Yeah, absolutely. So A Fortunate Age is kind of a big epic that is about what is going to sound like a very trivial subject matter. So it's about a group of friends who are all Oberlin grads. So they have this kind of liberal, artistic, intellectual bent, who converge in New York in 1998 and try to make their way in, let's just call it like New York's kind of bohemian world, and kind of find themselves crushed by it. They're trying to carve out lives for themselves that are different than their kind of bourgeois parents. They want to kind of be a part of New York's artistic and intellectual worlds. And some of them find success in ways they didn't imagine. Others are really kind of, wrecked, eviscerated by life in New York. It's loosely based on Mary McCarthy's novel, The Group, which is set during and just at the end of the Depression. And I was struck by the parallels between McCarthy's 1930s New York and the New York of the early aughts, post September 11th. So I really wanted to write a novel that was about the middle class. And the final thing I'll say about it is just that all the characters in it are Jewish in some way or another. And part of my intent in writing this book was I was interested in the fact that I worked as a book reviewer for a lot of the time that I was writing it. And I was interested in the fact that so many of the novels that I read about young people in New York were stripped of all ethnicity. And like everyone was just kind of generically American, even sometimes when the books were written by people who I knew were persons of color or what have you. And so I was interested in kind of writing a book about the world that I came from, which was very much kind of like the world of the New York suburbs in Manhattan, Brooklyn, where my family was, where people were of all different ethnicities. But I specifically wanted to write a book, and it was almost a trick. I was like, I'm going to make all these characters Jewish, and let's see if anyone notices that they're not just generically American. Anyway, My Salinger Year in some ways covers similar territory. It's a memoir, not a novel, I should say. And it takes place over the course of 1 year, 1996, when I worked as an assistant at New York's oldest and most storied literary agency, which represented and now represents the estate of J.D. Salinger. And it was an unusual year for Salinger because he decided to publish a new book, which was really an old book. He decided to publish a standalone book version of a very long, almost novella-length short story of his that had been published in the New Yorker in the 60s. And so he kind of came out of his hermitude. I was told when I took the job, you'll never see him, you'll never hear from him. People sometimes take this job thinking they're going to make Salinger their best friend. But he's never even going to call. And even if he does call, you're not going to talk to him. He's going to be put through directly to your boss. And then basically on my first day, I picked up the phone and it was Salinger. So yeah, so it covers that. And it's also about, similarly to A Fortunate Age, it's about living in New York as a very young, idealistic person, dating the wrong people and doing the wrong things and having no idea what you're doing at all, but thinking you know everything and have all the answers.
I love the way the book, you come to learn about yourself as the book, goes on, and you find your voice, and it's a pleasure to read. So I'm wondering if you would read a short passage for us.
Yeah, I'll read a tiny, tiny passage. Okay. And I know that some of the people, maybe many of the people at this event have read the book and possibly have heard me, seen me. And so I apologize if you heard me read this passage before, but maybe it was 5 or 6 years ago. So you've forgotten it by now. Okay, so basically what is happening in this passage, this is my first day at work. And my boss was this kind of grand dame of publishing. So I started right after the new year in 1996, and she swooped into the office wearing an enormous whiskey mink coat with huge sunglasses. And huge sunglasses, if any of you who, remember 1996, they were not fashionable then. These were like sunglasses that were manufactured circa 1980, and with a cigarette in one hand, she chain smoked all day in the office. You had with whiskey in her desk. It was a very different universe than today. And so I had lied to get this job. I had said that I could type 60 words a minute, but I actually could not type at all. And my boss was under the impression that I could use something called a dictaphone, which I didn't even know what a dictaphone was. So I had spent the whole day at my desk kind of typing her dictation very slowly and painfully and making lots of typos and having no idea what I was doing. I couldn't even figure out how to turn the typewriter on. And I was waiting for someone to tell me to go to lunch, but no one told me. And I hadn't eaten breakfast. I was getting hungrier and hungrier. And finally at about 3 o'clock, this man who's kind of the office manager, that's the only way I can describe him, realized that no one had told me to go to lunch and said, go get yourself something to eat. And this is what happens when I come back. Okay, back at my desk, I set down my sandwich and slipped off my coat. As I pulled out my chair to sit down, my boss appeared in the doorway to her office. Oh, good, you're back, she said. Come in and have a seat. We have some things to talk about. Glancing sadly at my sandwich, wrapped tightly in white butcher paper, I walked into her office and sat down in one of the straight-back chairs that faced her desk. So, she said, settling in her own chair, we need to talk about Jerry. I nodded, though I had no idea who Jerry was. People are going to call and ask for his address, his phone number. They're going to ask you to put them in touch with him, or me. She laughed at the ridiculousness of this. Reporters will call, students, graduate students. She rolled her eyes. They'll say they want to interview him or give him a prize or an honorary degree or who knows what. Producers will call about the film rights. They'll try to get around you. They may be very persuasive, very manipulative, but you must never. Behind her huge, heavy glasses, her eyes narrowed, and she leaned across the desk like a caricature of a gangster, her voice taking on a frightening edge. Never, never, never give out his address or phone number. Don't tell them anything. Don't answer their questions. Just get off the phone as quickly as possible. Do you understand? I nodded. Never, ever, ever are you to give out his address or phone number. I understand, I told her, though I wasn't sure I did, as I didn't know who Jerry was. This was 1996, and the first Jerry that came to mind was Seinfeld, who presumably wasn't a client of the agency, though one never knew, I supposed. Okay, she said, sitting back in her chair. You understand. Now, go. I'm going to take a look at your correspondence. She gestured to the pile of letters I'd typed, neatly stacked on her desk. As I left her office, smoothing my skirt, I happened to glance at the bookcases directly to the right of her doorway, on the opposite side of my desk. I'd been staring at that bookcase all day, staring at it without seeing it, so focused was I on my typing. The case held books in corresponding hues, mustard, maroon, turquoise, imprinted with bold black type. I'd seen these books countless times, in my parents' bookcase and the English department closet at my high school, at every bookstore and library I'd ever visited, and, of course, in the hands of friends. I'd never read them myself, due at first purely to happenstance, then to conscious choice. Books so ubiquitous on the contemporary bookshelf I barely noticed them. The Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zoe, 9 Stories. Salinger, the agency represented J.D. Salinger. I'd reached my desk before it hit me. Oh, I thought, that Jerry.
Awesome. So why did you choose to write a memoir rather than a novel? And what were the things that you were, weighing the pluses and minuses and making your decision?
That's a good question. And the answer is not what you would expect, which is that I had absolutely zero desire to write a memoir. As I said, I spent many years working primarily as a book critic and a books journalist, and thus I read a lot of memoir. The year that I worked at the agency, which is in real life is called Harold Ober Associates, the year that I worked there was actually the year that the memoir kind of came into its own. It was the year that Mary Karr's The Liars Club came out, and all of these, not all of these, but a bunch of memoirs came out that became huge bestsellers. And that year, I remember it so well, the critic James Atlas, a friend of mine is saying, Frank McCourt, Angela's Ashes. That is so right. Yes, these books were huge. They were everywhere. And thank you, Lori. And James Atlas, a critic I hugely admired, wrote a cover story for the Times Magazine that essentially was called something like, yes, someone else is saying, Elizabeth Wurtzel. Yes, all of these books. This is around the time they all came out. Thank you. And I didn't realize how valuable this chat function was. Thank you, guys. The other events I've done, the chat has actually been disabled because they felt like it was too overwhelming for the writer, but this is really helpful. So anyway, James Atlas wrote this cover story for the Times Magazine that was called something like The Age of Memoir, or Fiction is Dead, or both of those things at once. And I remember reading it and being so angry, I kind of threw it across the room. I lived in the apartment that I lived in My Salinger Year, and got really angry about it because I felt like this is dumb. And I tried reading The Liars Club, I didn't like it. I was very anti-memoir. And there was a whole spate of memoirs by youngish people, including people I vaguely knew. And I felt like, why are these people writing memoirs? If they really had any chops, they would be turning their experiences into Ramona Clay's, writing novels rather than memoir. However, as a magazine journalist, I was definitely occasionally asked to write personal essays. And I loved personal essays. I loved Dinian. I really, really loved a writer who now is kind of controversial, but at the time she was not. She was considered kind of the voice of my generation, Megan Daum, who wrote a really powerful essay in the New Yorker called My Misspent Youth. And I felt like that essay changed my life. And I loved her. I was a huge fan of hers. Eventually, actually, we became friends and we had the same agent, and I felt like my life was complete. But so point is that I eventually wrote an essay about answering Salinger's fan mail that got a lot of attention. I already had an agent at that point, but I was swamped with emails, letters, cards, calls from agents, that the piece actually spurred a bunch of other pieces. I was interviewed by all these newspapers, and I was pretty surprised. And I, even like people approaching me about film rights and about a bunch of editors approached me about turning it into a book. And I talked about it with my agent at the time, and I was working on A Fortunate Age. And she said, and I was poor, I was a freelance journalist, I needed money. And she said, no, you don't want to turn this into, you don't want this to be your first book, because then you'll be known as the Salinger Girl. Like Joyce Maynard is known as the Salinger Girl. You don't want to be known as the Salinger Girl. So just finish your novel, publish your novel, and then we'll see. And I just kind of dismissed the idea. But the thing that is crazy is this essay had such a long life. Like I would say every 6 months or so, an editor would find a copy of it in like the bathroom of a country house, because this is before everything was online. And read it and be like, oh my God, this should be a book. And then I would get a call from some editor saying, turn this into a book. And I would call my agent again and she would say no. So end of the story is I published A Fortunate Age and was, in a very sort of kind of fraught way trying to work on my second novel. And if there are any writers on here, I know that there are, second novels I think are the hardest. And they tell you, they being like everyone in the world, editors, agents, your writer friends, everyone tells you that you should start working on your second novel basically the minute you finish your first one, the minute you sell your first one, so that there isn't this kind of anxiety of your own influence. So if your first novel is, if your first novel is like, gets any attention at all, somehow there's this feeling that you have to replicate it, or that you have to do something completely different, that you have to respond to all the criticism of it and write. So I actually felt like I had to write something bigger and more kind of like stereotypically masculine, like, and I was trying to write this novel that was partially about like the Holocaust, and it was just huge and not even what I really wanted to write. And anyway, but I was trying to do this. And meanwhile, my father, with whom I was very close, was dying of a kind of Parkinson's like ailment. It was horrible. And I was having and I had 2 small kids. I was having a lot of trouble concentrating on this novel and was instead writing a lot of nonfiction pieces. So amidst all this, the end of the story is that Salinger died, like not that long after A Fortunate Age came out. And I wrote another piece. A bunch of magazines and radio shows asked me to write pieces about Salinger upon his death, and so I did. And then suddenly, I got all the calls and what have you. And one of those calls was from the BBC, who asked me to put together a full-length radio documentary about the fans, not about Salinger himself. And so this sounded like a fun, different thing. I had actually done a bunch of radio and I loved radio, and I felt like this will be great. So I did this. And when the script was kind of locked down, I can't remember if we had actually even recorded it yet. We had of course recorded in the field, but you do all this reporting. We did 9 months of reporting, and then I wrote a script with this, passing it back and forth with the producer, and that script was circulated in the British publishing industry, because the BBC has its own imprint with Random House UK. So I got a call from an editor at Random House UK saying, "Do you want to turn this into a book?" And I was like, "No." And that was the end. But he kept pushing and pushing, and he got to my agent and was pushing with her, and she kept saying, "No, you don't want to do this." And then one day she called me and said, this is crazy that I can't remember this, but either the editor was in New York and he was coming in to meet with her, or he just convinced her to have a long phone meeting with him, a phone conference. So she spent a bunch of time talking to him, called me back and said, "He convinced me, I think you should do it." And I still said no. I was like, I don't like memoir. I don't want to write a memoir. I think that this is trivial. Like, how am I going to write a book about the year I was 23 and 24? I mean, give me a break. That's ridiculous. She said, "Okay, just try writing the first few pages and see how it feels. And so I gave myself like a week or so. And one day I worked in a shared writer space at that point that was by the High Line in New York. So I kept sitting at my desk and I was like, I don't know. And I would just kind of sit there staring off into space. And one day at the end of the day, I took a walk I actually took a run on the High Line and then walked back. And as I was running, all of these young women in, you know, cheap office clothing were kind of going in the other direction as me. Like they were, I don't know if they were going home from work or walking to the train. And I suddenly realized this book is not just about me. It's about what it means to be a young person just starting off in the world. This is about something larger than me. And I sat down and wrote the first, say, 25 pages of the book and sent it to my agent. And she said, yes. And that was the end.
You were off to this.
But the postscript to it is that, you know, she took those 25 pages and sold them. And then I had a contract for the book. And I was then paralyzed and was like, no, I can't write this. I can't write a memoir. And in that time, I actually went to see Joan Didion speak at Symphony Space about Blue Nights. And she, in that interview, basically told the same story, that she wrote a little bit of it, sold it, and then kept sitting down at her desk and was like, no, I can't write this. And I thought, oh my God, Joan Didion feels this way too. And she kept saying, I thought I was going to have to give back the advance. And I was like, me too. And then, you know, obviously she wrote it. And I obviously wrote it too. But when I turned it in a couple years later, my agent actually said to me, I think you should publish this as a novel. It reads like a novel. It doesn't read like a memoir, which is my goal in writing it. Every day when I sat down to write it, I had a little index card that said, this is a novel. You are a character. Everyone is a character. And I would post it up there just to remind myself of that. And I thought, I guess so. Okay. And so she proposed this to my editor, my publisher, Knopf, and they were like, no, not doing that. So.
Wow. So then it's made into a film. You know, what was it like to be a consultant on the project, and, you know, how did the film happen?
It was really fun. So I'm trying to think. It's, of course, so all films, as I'm sure everyone knows, films take a long time to make. A friend of mine who is a filmmaker is on this call, and I hope that she's nodding. Though she seems to get her films made relatively quickly. But yeah, films take a long time to make. I was actually pretty lucky in that it was approximately 4 years from the time that I decided on a team to make the film to when we started shooting, which is, again, like pretty short, especially for a film that's not a huge studio production. So the My Salinger Year film falls into this kind of middle ground where it's not a huge studio production. Like the director likes to say, it's not like Star Wars. Like whenever I ask him a question, you know, like, will it be released on the same date worldwide? He's like, it's not like Star Wars. So it's not like Star Wars. Presumably he means all the Star Wars films, not just the original Star Wars film. But anyway, but it's also not like a tiny indie film that, you know, is like fighting for funding. It was sort of in the middle, and had a, you know, it of course has a huge movie star starring in it, so it had a decent amount of funding and interest. So what was it like? So basically, to start from the beginning, there was a lot of interest in turning it into a film, and I actually had initially sold the film rights, or it was optioned just based on my proposal. And so for the first couple of years, I actually worked with a really wonderful and kind of famous screenwriter named Emma Forrest, who was hired to write the screenplay, and also a really great production company that's responsible for films like Brokeback Mountain and like great, they only do literary adaptations. They're called River Road. So we worked with them, and the production company actually was very unhappy with Emma's script, and they fired her. And at that point, there was a feeling, this is all before My Salinger Year, the book, ever even came out, if you can believe it. This all happened. She wrote a script without having even read my book. She wrote the script while I was writing the book. And they felt that her script was too commercial, so they fired her, and the project seemed to kind of be dissolving. So when that option expired, because when you sell a book, right, you don't sell the rights outright, you option them. And that means that whoever buys it, like a production company, or it could be a screenwriter can option the rights, different companies can, or entities can option the rights. They just have the option to develop it for a certain amount of time. So when the option expired, about a year after My Salinger Year came out, my film agent sent it out again, and people had been expressing interest to her, so she sent it to all those people. So I was, having meetings with like a really wide range of people. So, like for instance, the creators of Gossip Girl, and and just like it was everything from like big companies to that guy, there's two people that created Gossip Girl. It was one of them. Like his company is on the smaller side, but they have a production deal with a big company. And then there was the person who we eventually sold the rights to, who is a director named Philippe Falardeau, who I'd say like, I think 2 years before, he had been nominated for an Oscar for a film called Monsieur Lazare. I know I haven't pronounced that right because I speak fake French. I don't speak real French. That is an amazing film that I loved. And my agent, he was really different than everyone else because he was an auteur, and basically he had never made an English language film, and he had never made a film in which a woman was the protagonist. So he happened to just have read My Salinger Year on vacation and was like, I want this to be my film. He had no idea that if the rights were available. He just happened to call right when they were selling the rights. And he was the one person who, he lives in Montreal. He's based in Montreal. He flew to Cambridge to meet with me. We spent the whole day together. And he had already, sketched out the set for the film. He had a whole notebook filled with his ideas for it. And I immediately thought, like, this is the person. In part because when you have your rights optioned by a huge studio, you don't know that they're going to actually make the film. And those rights could be tied up for years. And you also don't know how much say you have in it. And with Philippe, it was very clear. I mean, it was clear because he said it to me straightforwardly that he would have me on as a consultant. He said to me from the beginning, I'm not a writer. I'm a filmmaker. I usually adapt things, and I usually collaborate with the person that wrote the original work. So I would want you to be as involved as possible. And he was trying to gauge how much I would be okay with fictionalizing. And I was fine with it because I love film. My dad was an actor in his youth, and I grew up like watching movies with him like every day. And I watch movies like as if I'm taking a clock apart. So I got it. I was like, of course it has to be fictionalized and you have to compress things. So anyway, I went with him. I was very involved in the process. He would send me drafts of scripts. I would mark them up and send him back 10 pages of notes. He would then rewrite them. Eventually I was hired to just do an overhaul of the script. I would have, Skype calls with the costumers and the set designers and the props master and the actors. And, up until the day that they started shooting, which was actually like almost exactly 1 year ago today, I was, rewriting scenes for the film. And then I wasn't on set for the whole time, but I was on set for about a week. So it was exciting. And I know that I, in general, had the best possible experience for a writer, and that I had this team of people who really respected me as a writer. Like it wasn't just that they respected my story and that they were like, this is your story, we're going to tell it the way you want to tell it. But it was more that they got that I was a writer and a storyteller, and that I was there to kind of help them figure out the story and tell it in the best way possible. Mm-hmm. They also consulted me about casting a lot. And a few years ago when they were trying to figure out who should play me, because they considered that the main role at the time, the me role. And it is, but the boss role is a great role too, the older woman in the film. And the casting director was talking about people, wonderful actors like Elle Fanning. There aren't that many actors who are the exact right age, who sort of had the kind of like silly intellectual, emotionally transparent kind of vibe that they needed for the role. And I, at the time, was watching The Leftovers, which hopefully you guys have seen because it's so wonderful, especially the first season. And the person who plays the daughter on The Leftovers, Margaret Qualley, is so wonderful in that series. And I kept thinking to myself, she's not famous. I don't know who she is, but couldn't they get her? And one night my husband turned to me and said, why don't they just cast her? She so reminds me of you when you were this age. And I was like, what? I was thinking the same thing. And so a few days later, I had my millionth conference with the director about who to cast as me. And I said, what about Margaret Qualley? And he said, oh, Margaret Qualley, she desperately wants this role. Her agent keeps calling us, but I don't think she's well known enough. I've never seen her in anything. Who is she? And I was like, you have to watch The Leftovers. And, to make a long story short, they cast her. They listened to me. And, wow. And I will say, this was a weird situation in which I was right. I was like, she's so talented and she's now huge and everywhere. And,
that's awesome.
Right. I should be a casting director. That's my phantom career.
So do we have some photos from the Berlin Film Festival, Sam, that you could throw up?
Oh, I think this is a clip from the film. Oh, okay. So yeah, the film premiered, I think, maybe I should explain so these photos make sense. The film had its world premiere at the Berlin Film Festival in February, right before, basically the world went on lockdown. So there was a little bit the feeling that we were on the Titanic, violins were playing, and we were dancing as the ship sank. And the night, it was actually the opening film of the festival, which is a pretty big deal. So there was a huge gala that followed it, and days and days of press and dinners and what have you. And it was pretty fun and pretty exciting. And the reception of it at the festival was pretty great. People seemed to love it. It played to theaters. There were sometimes at 1,700% capacity, which is crazy, to see a film in a theater that large. I introduced it one night at a huge theater in Charlottenburg, and audiences were just kind of going crazy, crying, laughing. It was pretty wonderful. This photo and the one you just saw are from the photo call, which if you work in the industry, you know what that is. I do not really understand what that is. It basically is a strange, film and TV industry phenomenon where prior to your press conference, you walk into a room where there's a backdrop for whatever you're attending, like con, whatever it is. And as you can see, this is maybe a quarter of the photographers that were there. All these photographers shout your name. They're like, Joanna, over here, Ms. Rakoff, over here, look left, can you put your hand on your hip, show us your dress, blah, 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 tilt your head up. And so I did not realize that I was going to have to do this. I thought it was just for actors, but no, I did. And I would have prepared myself a little, though it did occur, when they sent me to hair and makeup, I was like, interesting. And so 5 minutes before this happened, I suddenly had this nauseating realization, that I was going to have to step out into this room and be photographed. And everyone could see that I was completely freaking out, and the publicists were getting very nervous. And Margaret Qualley basically put her hands on my shoulders and was like, okay, I'm going to tell you what to do. It's really not a big deal. Stand up straight, like, you can see I'm not actually standing up straight. My head is like this, but anyway, stand up straight. You just want to like always try to, not press your arm into your body, have your hands on your hips or your hand in some way that it's separate from your body. And you just kind of slowly make your way around the room. And then after you've made your way around the room, if someone calls to you, you turn to them. And so I tried to just do what she said.
It's funny. So I have like 5 more questions, but I don't want to be greedy. And I know that there are a lot of other questions. So
do we want to watch the clip real quick?
Oh, sure.
And if Jerry calls, you just say, yes, Jerry. I will let my boss know.
Jerry Salinger.
Well, of course, Jerry Salinger. And above all, you never, ever call him.
Why would I call Jerry Salinger?
Jerry doesn't want to hear about how much you love The Catcher in the Rye, and he doesn't want to read your stories.
I don't have stories.
Good. Writers make the worst assistants. Get to work.
So I'll turn it over to Sam, who would you like to call on people who may have questions? I think Tina had the first question. And Tina, do you want to?
If you have a question, if you could please just unmute yourself.
My audio. My question was about the Don character, because was he based on a real boyfriend, or was he just totally fictional, or, and if he was a real character, how did he feel about being in the book?
He is a real person, yes. Obviously his name and the kind of details of his background were changed for legal reasons. So a funny thing about that character, I still to this day get so much mail about that character, and people still post on social media about reading My Salinger Year, and so often one of the things, or sometimes the only thing they say is, I wanted her to leave Don so badly, and what have you. So that character, definitely provokes a strong visceral response in people. The funny thing about him is that some of the mail that I've gotten has been extremely, negative and critical, and said, like, I don't believe that character is real, because why would someone as nice and smart as Joanna? I should interject here that people often perceive the memoir as a novel, and so they'll maybe they're not even realizing that the character has the same name as me. I don't really understand. Anyway, saying, why would someone so nice and smart and sweet stay with someone that awful? And I sometimes feel like, have you ever been in the world? Aren't there tons of nice and sweet and smart young women or older women who are with horrible, horrible men? What I also want to say to them is, in my initial draft of the book, there was actually a lot more of Don, and there were certain scenes where he's even more horrible than he is in the book itself, like the scene where he suggests that I see a plastic surgeon and get a nose job, and how he's constantly telling me to, work out, and he was pretty horrible. I have friends who are on here now who knew him, and I think they're all probably sitting in their houses in Brooklyn laughing. But yeah, so how did he feel about being in the book? He's an intense narcissist. And I actually interviewed him for the book. And he was so thrilled to be interviewed. I just wanted to see if my memories of things matched his, and also just see if he remembered anything that I didn't. And interestingly, our memories were actually quite aligned. I was not misremembering things. So that was actually really helpful to know. And he told me some stories that, I remembered once he said them, and I just hadn't thought so much about them in years. And he seemed fine with being in the book. I did not speak to him after it came out, and he didn't contact me. In fact, no one in the book contacted me except for a person who has a very, very minor role in it. And I was surprised by that. But yeah, so I don't know how he felt about it, but he felt okay with it in theory.
Thank you. He was an interesting character, and I wonder who is playing him in the movie? What actor?
He's played by actually a really wonderful actor who the casting choice was really controversial in the making of the film, named Douglas Booth. Do you guys know who this actor is? So he, in the UK, is hugely famous. He's like a big heartthrob. He's been in like a bunch of BBC adaptations, and I feel like he had this one really funny role in which he played like a member of Motley Crue. Is that right? I feel like there's a biopic about Motley Crue, and he's one of the characters in it. But he got a lot of attention for that. Anyway, he's a real sort of heartthrobby sort of guy. There are a lot of like Instagram fan accounts for him because people love him so much. But the director, and so Sigourney Weaver and Douglas Booth are represented by the same agent. And Sigourney thinks he's an incredible actor and was really excited to have him play this role. And I think she actually, either she or the agent suggested him. But the director felt like he was too much of a pretty boy and he wanted someone who was kind of grittier looking. So they did a lot to try to make him look kind of, I think he actually gained weight for the role. He has like a bit of like a pot belly, and they changed his hairstyle, and they gave him glasses. But he's still like a very handsome man. So yeah, he's pretty incredible, honestly, as John. Even his American accent is great.
So we have about 8 minutes left on our scheduled time, and we appreciate Joanna and all of her comments and insights. Are there any questions out there? You can feel free to just let me know via chat, and then you can unmute yourself.
Well, then I'll ask a question real quickly. Midway through the book, you go home to visit your parents, and your father reveals to you that he took out student loans in your name without your knowledge, and he forged your signature on the applications. And he tells you that the payments to these loans are your responsibility now, even though he knows you don't have enough money to cover them. I'm just, like, you don't talk a lot about your feelings about it in the book. And I want to know, like, how did you feel about it then? And how do you feel about it now? Like, with so much distance, is it something that helped you in your life? Did it make you more financially responsible?
No. And I'm going to answer super quickly because I see a couple of people saying they have questions in chat. So no, it did not make me more financially responsible. It actually was really detrimental to my life, honestly, because it, I suddenly had all this debt that I hadn't known that I had. And I had been living a really, really frugal existence. And I couldn't make these payments. And I, at the time I had to go on, I guess, like hardship forbearance, I think. And then I was in grad school. And so I kept going on forbearance, and they just kept growing larger. And here I am all these years later, I'm still paying off those student loans. And it almost made me less financially responsible because I felt like I have this debt that I'm never going to be able to pay back. And I definitely was, angry at my parents. And without getting too much into it, I have an older sister, and my parents, who had a lot of problems in school and went to a million different schools and did a bunch of different things. And she got a degree in something very practical. She was a nurse eventually, and then a nurse practitioner, and they paid for all her schooling. But for me, they did not. And so, I guess, like, I'm not an advice giver, but my advice to all parents is to make everything equal to all of your children so that there's no resentment. So yeah, you would think that it would have taught me responsibility, but it didn't. It made me feel like, screw this. I'm just going to buy that dress because who cares? I'm never going to pay off this debt. So I may as well have the thing I want,
Totally.
Anyway, I think, should I look and see what these questions are? Or?
Absolutely. It looks like there's 3 in the queue, and I think that's probably going to be all that we have time for. Well, there's one last one from Amy at Ragdale. So if you can get those 4, I think we'll call it.
Okay, I'm going to do like a rapid fire round of answering. Okay, let's see. Okay. Did the screenwriting, this is from a wonderful writer named Ashley Renard, who you're going to probably see her memoir everywhere in a couple of years. Did the screenwriting experience make you want to write again for film? That's such a good question. The really short answer is yes. I loved the experience. I actually started out wanting to go into film, wanting to not just write screenplays, but to direct film. And my application to Columbia's MFA program was initially to their film program. And I, at the very last minute, whited out, because this was so long ago that you typed things, I whited out the check mark on the film box and made a check mark in the writing program box at the very last minute. So my recommendations were about me as a potential filmmaker. I don't know why they admitted me to the writing program. So this was kind of the realization of a huge dream for me, as some of my old friends who are on here know. And I actually, my next project was supposed, and I talked about this a bunch in Berlin, my next projects were supposed to be turning my new book and A Fortunate Age into adapting them for TV, and going out with both of those and seeing what happened and which project was the better for me to work on at the time. So that's of course been delayed, and maybe it's better because it means that I'll now finish my new book and then I can move on to that. But yeah, I loved it, and it really made a lot of sense for me. I think I'm really social, and so I like to sit by myself and write, but I also like to do things with other people. So I love not just the writing, but being on set. Okay. Are there thoughts you have on using dialogue in memoir? What guides you? That's such a good question. And this is something, I just read Anne Patchett's collection of essays. This is the Story of a Happy Marriage. Am I getting that title right? I'm not sure. It's something like that. And she talks about actually her work as a fiction writer versus that of her late friend Lucy Greeley, who, she of course wrote a whole memoir about called Truth and Beauty. And she talks about the different ways that a memoirist uses dialogue versus the way a fiction writer uses dialogue. And what she basically says is they're the same. Like she says, did Lucy, is she recreating dialogue she remembers? Yes. Is she making it up? Of course she is. She's using it in the same way that a fiction writer does. And that's basically how I feel as well. And it took me a long time. It took me years of working on My Salinger Year to come to that realization, to understand that you do have to recreate it, and that's okay, because the point is to create, not to sound cheesy, but a piece of art. It's not your journal, it's a piece of art, and you have to shape it. So you have to make up dialogue, and trying to be faithful to what really happened. Okay. Joanna, hello. This is from Danny Hollis. And I just want to say the last question was from Lori Gwen Shapiro, who's an amazing writer. You all should read her book, The Stowaway, and also an incredible documentary filmmaker. This is from Danny Hollis. What surprised you most about your previous time at Ragdale? And what are you missing most about not being on site right now? This is really similar to a question from Amy Sinclair of Ragdale, where she says, why are residencies important to you? Okay, really quickly. What surprised me most about my time at Ragdale, the first one a long time ago, was just that I don't mean to sound negative, but there's a sort of free fall element to being on a residency when you're used to, especially maybe if you live in a city and you're super busy all the time and kind of hustling. And like I was working as a freelance writer, so I was hustling all the time, trying to drum up work, and it always felt like an uphill battle. And I was so busy just all the time. And then I got to Ragdale and I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to wash dishes. I didn't have to do anything at all. And I think there's this moment where kind of fear sets in and you're like, wait, I have no excuse now. I really have to do this. And I think for some people, to be honest, I know people personally who that fear can be paralyzing, but usually you get over the hump and then the fear becomes productive fear, you know, that kind of like anxious fear that Taffy Burdesser-Akner talks about, like it becomes that. And so that, but that did surprise me at first. I thought I would just get there and immediately be productive. And instead I became like, I felt like I was going to die with anxiety. But what I'm missing most, residencies have changed for me. So I went on a residency, basically, let's see, in 2003, I went to the MacDowell Colony and I wrote the first half of A Fortunate Age, which was actually like 400 pages in 2 months. I also wrote some articles while I was there. And then it took me a few years to write the second 400 pages of that book. The book is not 800 pages. I just feel like I should say, don't worry, it was cut down. But at that residency, at that particular residency in 2003, I didn't have kids yet. And I was so able to just kind of block everything out and sink into my characters and their world in a way that I couldn't in real life. And all around me, you know, there were people who were like having affairs and like driving to like Keene or wherever, I don't know, like malls to like go shopping, or like they were going to the gym, but I was not. Like I just went to my studio and worked all day, and I made very close friends, but I really just worked. And you know, I was sometimes so involved in my characters' lives that I would emerge from my studio and I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't do anything. I would sometimes skip dinner because I felt like I couldn't talk to people. So I think that's, for me, the real value of the residency, that you can just drop into the world of a long project in a way that you can't in real life. You just can't, no matter who you are and what your life is like, you cannot do that. Now I have 3 kids. And so exactly a year ago, I returned to MacDowell for the first time since 2003. And intriguingly, it was like the staff was almost the same, and they remembered me and they were like, welcome back. And I was like, what? Oh my gosh. So everyone loves it here, not just residents. And the residency had really changed for me in a certain way. Like I spent, I would say, my first 3 days there, honestly, in a state of shock, not fear, but kind of shock, that because I'm so used to taking care of 3 kids and a husband, and I have an elderly mom who requires a lot of monitoring and just life, and to just be there and kind of be taken care of was crazy. I sort of slept for 3 days. So it's different. If you do have kids, a residency does give you this chance to not have to take care of anyone for a few days. So I think that probably brings us to the end of our time. Is that right, Sam? Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending.